folks joining us from all over today?
All over, but majority of the ones that you're seeing mostly on here are members. So the lots from Ontario. So again, we're going to start with some Ontario briefly, but and then we'll cover into contracts and clauses and stuff. So
Terrific.
all right, all right. Let's get rocking and rolling. Thanks everybody for spending some time with us today. I'm happy to introduce Ivan. Ivan, say hello.
Hey, everybody, it's Ivan Merrow here.
Yeah, Ivan Merrow, and he is a lawyer, a litigator, a man of extraordinary talent. Actually, my own, I would say, one of the best lawyers that I've personally used and would recommend. Again, got me out of some hot water and did it very, very well, to say the least. Again, somebody you want to have on your side when things don't go well. And when your back's against the wall, this is the man you want to have in your court. He is the founder of BuildRight Law here in Ontario, Canada. All right, and specializes in corporate and I guess some residential as well, construction law. So he's going to share with us for my Ontario folks. We're going to have a quick discussion in around some of the payment terms here in Ontario, especially the Prompt Payment Act and how we should be utilizing that. And then we'd like to slide a little bit into just what our contracts should be and how it's used as a tool. And with that said, Ivan, I would love for you to take it away and maybe we can start on what makes a contract actually legally enforceable here in Ontario.
Yeah, perfect. And right before I jump into that topic, you don't need to wait to call me until your back is against the wall. If you would like to talk about your contract before you get into hot water, more than happy to provide some advice. I've got a front end contract development part of my practice and a dispute resolution part of my practice. And that's traditional for a lot of construction lawyers here in Ontario, where we've got a ton of building happening and unfortunately also a ton of disputes. But I'll take it from the top. Thank you, everybody who contributed to our list of topics today. I understand that was a bit of a collaborative exercise, and for Jay for organizing us all together. What makes a contract legally enforceable in Ontario? And I'm going to refer back to Ontario a few times. Quick caveat on that. I'm a licensed lawyer in the jurisdiction of the province of Ontario in Canada. So for those joining us outside of the province of Ontario, note that I'm not giving legal advice for your jurisdictions. And so you should always, always, always consult with a licensed lawyer in your jurisdiction for advice that's going to be applicable to your zone where you're offering your services. That being said, in the States and Canada outside of the province of Quebec, we're generally under the common law. So I'm going to be talking about common law principles and then Ontario specific legislation. And that's the context that's important to understand. So, what makes a contract legally enforceable in Ontario? Three main elements in the common law to have a binding contract: offer, acceptance, and consideration. Offer and acceptance, not that difficult to understand. Consideration is the one that generates some confusion. And what we're trying to do here is separate out a non-binding promise to do something and differentiating that, just a promise or a commitment, as compared to a binding contract. And for a binding contract to occur, you have to have some consideration, some quid pro quo exchange of value. And so typically in a lot of contracts, that's why you will see the collection of an initial non-refundable deposit to mark the beginning of the relationship. Otherwise, something like the commencement of work would also be consideration because you're starting to offer value. But to have a binding contract in Ontario, those are the three basic starting points that you have to have: offer, typically in the form of an estimate in our construction business; acceptance, so clear confirmation of consent and agreement from the owner or the contractors in the room that do work for direct owners. And then consideration, what is the price going to be? There needs to be an exchange of value. This isn't just like a gift, it's an actual mutual agreement. You will be paid for the services you're going to supply.
Right. So then I think where a lot of contractors are most unclear is, and where I get a lot of the questions and a lot of our members, feel like they may be weak is, what are some of like the non-negotiable clauses that every contractor should have, in every agreement? Like what are the things that we should be focused on as contractors to really prevent or to, mitigate any type of, lawsuit or any type of claim against us? What are the ones that you see that are the most important?
Super important question. The three major building blocks of every construction contract are scope, time, and cost or price. Those are the three essentials. And if one of those are missing
Hmm.
or vague or not mutually understood, then that's a recipe for a later dispute. Obviously, one of the most common conflicts in construction contract execution are unclear scope, disagreements about what was included in the price versus excluded. So I would say that's one of the most important areas is being clear not just about what you are doing, but what you are not doing and
Right.
excluding things that are not supposed to be included in your price. That can go a long way to preventing disputes with the owner about what they were expecting to get in exchange for what they agreed to pay you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can all attest to that. And with that said, talk to me a little bit about, and I know we've talked about it, but like, how important is your payment schedule and having a solid payment schedule in place?
Critical. So what we're talking about with construction contracts, that's really a fallback, right?
Hmm.
In an ideal world, you wouldn't even need a contract. In a fantasy utopia, we could have a handshake deal. Both people do what they promise to do. You never need to look at the actual contract. It's there to refer back to when you need to double check what both sides promised to do. The payment schedule is super important for a couple reasons. Number one, it makes it crystal clear when the client is supposed to pay, so the time element, but it's even better if it's attached to a clear milestone or piece of scope. So it's very
Right.
clear what entitles you to that payment or that draw. And you can set it up monthly, so it's monthly draws based on progress. Other people do milestones. But the gold standard, I would say, or S tier way of setting up payment is
Hmm.
something tangible that once it's complete and it's something that an owner can see and understand, so you can take a picture of it and prove that it's done, that entitles you to a certain payment installment.
Hmm.
That is the easiest way to prove entitlement to how much you should be paid.
Okay. So I want to talk really briefly again in terms of Ontario's law, and again, very close to the common law, so it should be applicable to most people on the call. But we have, the prompt payment laws here in Ontario, which, again, being a contractor that has been in a few disputes here and there, has been largely misunderstood, and even by me, and what our tools or our methods are to collecting prompt payment. Can you maybe just quickly explain what it is and, what it isn't, I guess, to our Ontario folks and anyone else that has a similar law in their state or province?
Sure. So this is one where I would flag that it's going to be jurisdiction specific.
Hmm.
So in Ontario, our main piece of legislation that deals with construction projects is called the Construction Act. It was amended in 2018 to incorporate this concept of prompt payment that was already in place from some other jurisdictions, including in the States and the UK. Essentially, Jay, what prompt payment means in Ontario is that as long as your contract and the procurement process for it post dates July 1, 2018,
Hmm.
which is what we consider the new world of construction contracts in Ontario, and most residential jobs would fit in that. Everything but the largest public infrastructure jobs by now typically fit into that time window. It entitles by law contractors to be paid by owners within 28 days
Okay.
promptly. So that's very different because before we had that legislation in place, it was just by contract. And given the purchasing power and the unequal, unbalanced power relationship often between owners and contractors, and especially contractors and subs, by contract, people with more power would negotiate longer and longer payment terms. And if
Hmm.
you're starting at the very top with a payment on 90 days,
Yeah.
that made it so by the time the payment flowed down to the subs and suppliers closer to the bottom of the pyramid, we were getting smaller contractors strung out and unpaid for months or
Hmm.
years. And so this legislation was brought in. So it's 28 days for an owner to pay a contractor, and then contractors are supposed to pay subs within 7 days.
Okay. So now I think there's and I know I've just learned something new is that there's actually, alternatives to liens. So for most of us here, we would understand what a lien is. I have plenty of liens, unfortunately. Again, doing a high volume of roofing work, we've
Mhm.
definitely ran into these disputes, and I've had ones for 15 years that I'm still having to follow up and continue to try and enforce and collect. And recently we learned about other alternatives. Maybe you want to quickly chat about them and we could yeah, in terms
Sure.
of how to get paid with this Prompt Payment Act.
Yeah, so I'll talk broadly by common law. You can build in different ways to resolve disputes right into your contract.
Mm,
And so those can include things like mandatory mediation, which can be quite effective from a cost and time standpoint. You can build in dispute resolution mechanisms like arbitration, which can, in certain jurisdictions, especially in Ontario, move quite a bit faster than a court case. So you'd never see an arbitration go on in normal circumstances longer than 2 years. But with construction lien litigation and the ordinary public courts here in Ontario, cases can drag on for years and years, three,
mhm,
5, 7 years, depending on which courthouse you're in. And so what you're that is applicable across a whole bunch of different common law jurisdictions is thinking about in your contract if the value is high enough where it'd be worthwhile paying a private arbitrator to solve the dispute quickly. Many contractors opt for that and they
mhm.
make arbitration either an option that the contractor can elect to use or it's a mutual option for both sides to use. I think that's something that's jurisdiction um, limited and based is something like adjudication,
Right.
which is a new dispute resolution regime that was part of those construction legislation reforms here in Ontario. Adjudication, very high level. It's like a fast track arbitration where the whole process can be over in as little as 6 weeks. And
Wow.
that's very, very effective and can be quite cost effective to resolve a dispute. You can get an adjudicator on a flat rate basis to determine the matter and get you an interim binding decision within 6 weeks, which compared to
Wow.
court cases, lightning fast
Right.
in comparison to waiting years and years to having your lien dispute figured
A-
out.
And then that obviously puts pressure on whoever is, again, it takes that power imbalance away. It puts pressure on them to, produce documents and to be accountable to that payment, the payment terms that they agreed to. Because again, I've been involved in, I'm sure every other contractor at one point or another has been involved in a squeeze play where, somebody is actively taking advantage and thinks that, hey, oh well, I'll just, you can leave my property. I'll wait years to get paid. So this is kind of a fast track way. And again, it gives some contractors back a little bit of power, at least, especially when there is that, power imbalance that's occurring, right?
Totally. And that squeeze play you're talking about is the mentality of some predatory owners or people in the contract supply chain that take a catch me if you can approach
Hmm.
to their payment obligations. They don't particularly care for their commitment to pay their invoices by a particular deadline. And instead, they know that if your recourse is to pay thousands to hire a lawyer to
That's
chase
right.
them and wait in court for years and years, that you may be more willing to just take an unfair, unjustified haircut on your invoices rather than pay the money to chase them down.
Right.
And so one of the first things that you brought up, Jay, was the payment terms in your contract. And one issue that we didn't talk about is one of the best tools in your toolbox as a contractor is thinking about where the money is on the project and thinking about the payment schedule in terms of leverage
Yeah,
and getting as much of the value of the contract up front as you possibly can. Because if you are backloading payments on the project and the owner extracts the majority of the value of the project from you, while withholding the majority of value from you and not paying you until the end, that unfortunately maximizes the owner's leverage against you because they have all the money in their hand. And
totally.
so thinking about that payment structure over the course of the project and making sure it's balanced. It doesn't need to be 70% upfront upon ordering materials. That might be ideal from a cash flow standpoint, not realistic for most owners, but making sure that it's balanced enough where you get enough upfront where you've gotten value, you're protected, and then making sure you're not getting overextended,
Mhm.
delivering too much value, and not collecting the money in exchange.
Well, and one thing to add to this, what I don't think a lot of contractors really understand in terms of building a structure like this is that actually the less leverage that the customer has towards the end of the contract, meaning 10%. If there's 10% outstanding, you're going to have fewer complaints. You're going to have a happier customer, right? So I always recommend taking smaller payments more consistently. And that way, as the project's winding down, we see less, punch lists, we see less and less complaints, because they don't owe you a lot. It's when they have to cut that huge check at the end, it makes everybody kind of stop and wait, right? And again, that's where you see some delays, you see some hesitation because they're cutting the larger part, towards the end of the job. And I see that as being a big mistake that leaves your customer unsatisfied because no matter what, no matter how good you are, no matter how smooth things go, all right, that last check still causes them to stop for a second and think, what's my risk here, right? Because they're putting out that larger sum. Much better approach is to take smaller, more consistent payments throughout the job, and you're going to find yourself, again, with less of leverage from them, and also they're happier. Right? They're not cutting these huge checks towards the end, feeling like they're under pressure for it. And again, you guys, at 10%, that's not going to make or break you, right? So I always try to mention that the best policy is to prevent things from escalating and be able to de-escalate and have tools that allow you to do that. So with that said, I mean, what kind of tools could a contractor incorporate into his contract that would work towards de-escalating and preventing things from escalating to a legal matter? What do you see as being sort of one of those tools that we should all have?
Well, you specifically characterize it as tools in your contract. And
Hmm.
so
Yeah.
I want to caveat it and say one of the best parts of this group, from my understanding, is you talk a lot about risk mitigation outside the contract, right?
Hmm.
Good communication, maintaining a relationship, de-escalating conflict. All of those are risk mitigation strategies outside of the core contract. But if we get down to it and you're in that fallback position where you have a disagreement with the owner and you have to have resort to the contract to
Hmm.
decide who's right and who's wrong, who's entitled to payment, or if a loss or a delay or a cost overage happens, who owns that?
Right.
Then the contract should speak to those ambiguities and help iron them out. And the purpose is, number one, it should be simple enough to understand where the owner themselves can read the contract, realize what they're obligated to do and where they're obligated to pay you.
Right.
But even more importantly is if they go to get legal advice and they're thinking about progressing it into litigation, that their own lawyer
Yeah.
reads the contract and tells them that they are obligated to pay you and that
Right.
they should not go and progress this further. So that's the purpose of the contract, is to set those things out clearly. I can get into some specifics if that would be helpful, Jay.
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay, sure. So we talked about, the most important pieces of the contract being scope, time, and cost. Those have got to be clear and set out in a way that the owner is going to be able to understand and articulate for themselves and to their spouse at home
Hmm.
when and how much they are obliged to pay you based on what you've achieved. So those are the basics. You want to make sure it's covered off. How are changes to be dealt with? We all
Yes.
know it's the
Big time.
rare construction project that
Yeah.
remains the same and static from the very beginning, right? So if a
Hmm.
change happens, increase in scope, a delay, how is that going to be dealt with? I would say the gold standard, the S tier way of dealing with that is a written change order
Yep.
and setting the owner's expectations up front. If you change the scope midway through this job, that is going to have an impact on time and or cost. And
Hmm.
I'm going to write that out for you. You want to tell them in advance to the extent you can, you are making this change. Here's the change in scope. This is what the change is going to be in time. If the change in time is unknown, say why, but
Hmm.
make sure you've made it clear that they're not going to be going on the assumption that the schedule is not going to change, even though they completely switched up what they want you to build for them.
Hmm.
And then, most importantly, what is going to be the change in the price?
Right.
And then to take it to that next level, they need to sign and
Hmm.
initial the change order. So it's not just sending it to them and saying this is what the effect is going to be, and then have them go silent on you by
Right.
email. It's to put it in front of them and have them sign on the dotted line. Why? Because if they don't agree to pay more for the change they want to happen,
Hmm.
then you should not be going ahead with the change because
Right.
they haven't agreed to pay for it. And that is really what I would say a huge majority of construction disputes are
Totally.
about is the owner just does not understand that they cannot make major changes midway through the project
Hmm.
without experiencing a change in the time and the cost that goes along with it. And that's one of the best things you can have in your contract is pre-agree on how that's going to work. And then
Right.
there can be no confusion later why you're putting a document in front of them and
Hmm.
asking them to sign for an increase.
So one thing that we get our members to do and certainly encourage them that's been super helpful for us is what we call an addendum to work. All right. So, and again, been very effective. So essentially what it is an agreement on how much things are going to cost from a supervisor to, a field employee and how we're going to record those extras. So for things that are smaller ticket, we would call them, which in a renovation, remodeling project, there can be dozens. Okay, so we get them to initially when we meet with that customer because we want
Hmm.
to build trust first. We explain the change order process.
Hmm.
We start off with, hey, we have a contingency of $5,000. All
Hmm.
right, you're going to give me this addendum to work that says I have a blank check for 5 grand. I will justify it, but we're not going to stop work. This is how you will be billed. This will be the hours. But in order to keep production moving forward, we can't stop on the dime for every little, change that would, prevent the job. In that case, if there is a major one, we're going to inform you, properly, but it's going to be a cost plus situation. That's worked really, really well for a lot of us. Now, as you get into the bigger changes, of course, it's a full change order process, but again, explaining that, walking your customer through, and especially if you have a salesperson and you're transferring it now to a project manager, there has to be a transfer of trust where we do the courtesy of explaining what our contract means, right? Because again, the best way to prevent problems is to be clear, but it also gives you that second layer of, and we get them to sign off on it. It's a form that they fill out. We had the discussion about change work order. There is no confusion on how we're going to deal with this, and they feel more comfortable about it. They feel like they're more in control. It's when it's not discussed and it's just brought up on the fly, or it starts to accumulate and there's not clarity there, that you see a lot of those disputes. And again, from my own experience, like that's where at the end, even though you cranked it out of the park, you're still leaving with an unsatisfied customer. So, I mean, change order is huge. Maybe some of my commercial guys
Hmm.
that are signing somebody else's contract. This is a big problem, and one of
Hmm.
the funniest clauses that I love to just take my red pen to is "paid when get paid."
That's
Could
right.
you tell me a little bit about that? Because that's pretty universal across the board, especially for larger contractors or subcontractors,
Yeah.
and getting kind of caught in those clauses. Are paid if get paid.
Yeah. Yeah. Pay if paid. That's brutal. Listen, it's context dependent. We don't all have the luxury of a whole lot of choice in terms of making changes in contracts. There are certain lines of business. I can think of one of my best friends from school. He does residential work for new subdivisions for some of the big
Oh,
builders in
oh,
Ontario. no leverage for
None. It's
negotiations.
nasty.
If he
Yep.
says no to anything in the contract, they are pressing the button. Next, they know somebody else is in line.
Yep.
So you've got to, I'm not going to speak from a fantasy world where you can
Hmm.
just take any contract and red pen whatever you'd like.
Hmm.
We'd all like to build our businesses to the point where you can say no to any job and you can negotiate your price because you have the reviews and the client base and the security, and you don't have the dependence on limited numbers of customers to not be able to say no when they
Hmm.
ask you to sign something. So Jay, that basically is it's leverage dependent. I would say absolutely pay when paid and pay if paid type clauses should be struck if you can get away with it.
Hmm.
And I think you should try to say no because
Hmm.
that is a horrible situation that you can be stuck in where due to circumstances completely outside of your control, you're not getting paid. And that's the first layer of any contract review that you would have by a construction lawyer is they're going to look at the risk allocation
Right.
and make sure that to the extent possible, you want the risk allocation in the contract to match what you have control over.
Hmm.
Okay. So you should only bear the cost and risk of things that are inside your control. And where contracts are unfair and punitive to you is where you are contractually bearing risk for things that you cannot control.
Yep.
So things like owner supplied permits, licenses, and approvals. Under no circumstances should you bear the cost and risk of delay as a result of the owner not getting their stuff together in time. So
Right.
contracts should be setting out what you need from your contractual counterparty to be able to do your job. So site access, you may
Yep.
need certain owner supplied equipment, or if there's predecessor trades that need to be done before you get in and do your thing, that needs to be ironed out. So you can point back and say, we agreed, I would only bear the risk and cost of things that are in my control. I set out for you in the contract what I needed from you to do my job. But I'm not pretending like it's an amazing ideal world where every sub can just go to their GC and negotiate the terms that they want.
Hmm.
Often the situation is more along the lines of take it or leave it, pal. And sometimes you just have to take it.
Right, and I can certainly remember in the early stages of my career being exposed to these contract things and the shock and the pain that came with it. And I can
Mhm.
say honestly, my contract's been written with tears and blood. Um, every one of those clauses, and again, when you include things like high frequency cell towers in your contract, you've been through some shit, right? So at the end of the day, there's lessons to be learned. And again, when you look at some of these contracts and you really start to understand how to protect yourself, you can borrow some of that, as long as you're using a lawyer in terms of protecting yourself. Because a lot of my clauses come from more of a commercial, high stakes game that we play in the commercial side, where I feel there's a lot less rules. It's more about who has bigger pockets and what kind of position you get yourself to. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter quality, any of that stuff. It's all what you can prove, right? And again, how much you can bear before you break, right?
True, true. And so some important questions to ask yourself without getting into the nitty-gritty of the clauses you should be looking for, something that's applicable to residential and commercial,
Hmm.
are the questions you should be able to answer after reviewing the contract that's put in front of you. And you should have the list of what ifs, right?
Yep.
So the contract that you have, Jay, that's written in sweat and blood, that's because you've experienced enough what ifs to address those up front in your template. But
Hmm.
in the position where somebody else is giving you a template, you should be able to answer what happens if there is a delay? Delay caused by me, delay caused by them. What
Hmm.
happens if the scope changes? What am I obligated to do if I encounter something that prevents me from doing my job? Do
Right.
I have a notice obligation, a precondition to being able to recover for delay? Those are enforced very strictly in Ontario, and they can be ridiculously short timelines in contracts as well. 48 hours after knowing or ought to have known that there was a delay occurring on site. You have to provide written notice
Right.
by courier to the owner. Like there's crazy notice clauses that can be incorporated. that can disentitle you to recovering for damages
Right.
based on your failure to give notice. So
Hmm.
having that list of what ifs, so if there's a change, if there's a delay, if there's an interference or a force majeure event, all those different things should be answered. And then if you're not comfortable or you don't feel like your company could financially survive that event happening the
Hmm.
way the contract spells it out, then that may be a deal that is just a little outside of your business's ability to take on from a risk standpoint. If you're
Totally.
looking at it and saying, I could see this going to a place where I am actually obliged to keep working for 6 months,
Hmm.
waiting to be paid because of pay if paid, and that would actually bleed me out
Right.
and put me into a bankruptcy situation. It's things like that where yes, there are some deals that you can't negotiate amendments into. Then your negotiation is walk away and avoid. Maybe you take a bit of an L and it's like a less hot month from a revenue or leaves you with some capacity you would rather have filled. But it's worth it if you avoid a death sentence if you're getting
Totally.
into a situation that's just too risky for the amount of capital you actually have to survive a pretty skinny time in
Right.
billings.
And like, how often do you see this in like commercial business? Let's use it as an example because I think it's a pretty good, scope. In residential, I feel like a lot of them are more emotional, reactive,
Mm,
you know, I information, escalations. Whereas in commercial, I believe that there is intent on, going into certain jobs, and there's definitely, contractors and builders. You mentioned the Ontario builder market, which is
mm.
it's a dustpan, right? So, to say the least, and I come a bit from that background. So, what are like the real red flags and things that maybe contractors jumping from residential to commercial have to be, openly aware of in any situation?
Yeah, red flags. I mean, this is as much about diligence as it is, protecting yourself from a contractual end. You've got to use a mix of common sense and doing your diligence, calling around. Obviously, a red flag is taking over a project where another
Yes.
contractor has been terminated.
Never die for
Uh,
a falling sword.
well, it's always a danger situation where the last contractor has been terminated for default or has terminated for convenience because they've just given up and not even tried to recover the relationship with the GC or the owner. Huge red flag there. You've got to talk to the recently departed contractor,
Mm,
figure out what happened and how you can not fall into the same trap and price the job accordingly. Rule of thumb with taking over a job from another contractor, it's going to cost the owner double because you're
mm,
taking on so much unknown risk on a job site you didn't scope out from the beginning. You've really just got to map out those what if scenarios and then understand what that would mean from a financial perspective and understand what your business's survivability is and what your burn rate is, understanding the financial fundamentals. So, yes, we can talk about it from a legal contractual type standpoint, but I think business survival is equally about really knowing the finances of your business back to front, knowing how long you can go without payment, knowing what your job split is and how many of your eggs are in one basket, or if you've got a healthy spread across jobs. So if one owner goes bad, are you sunk or can
right.
you make it by, right? So I think there's a lot, that's a huge topic that probably justify a whole nother thing, but I want to make sure people benefit from my legal um my legal knowledge, not just
Right.
the business instinct stuff.
Right. So like, I'm probably guilty of this, but like when should a contractor actually, contact a lawyer? What are the signs and like what's the sign of waiting too long? Like, again, I think that most of us don't know when to get a lawyer involved and when it's appropriate to use, you know, um legal advice and get yourself into a better position.
So, at the risk of sounding biased because I'm a lawyer and therefore I'm carrying a hammer and every problem looks like a nail that a lawyer could solve, which is certainly not the case. There are a few inflection points where I think it's a good time to call a lawyer. Number one is when you're setting up your business or scaling and kind of getting to the next growth echelon,
Okay.
understanding your business structure and your basic liability. right? So as a sole proprietor, if you're just if I'm Ivan Merrow carrying on business as Merrow Carpentry, which I'm not qualified to do, then I bear 100% of the liability. That's on me personally. And so my personal assets as Ivan Merrow are at risk if there's litigation that happens where somebody comes after me. And so getting yourself set up and understanding that from a basic level of when you're ready to move from sole proprietor to corporation, that can be very important and helpful. So that's on business inception or when you're ready to take that next step when scaling.
Oh, I think you got muted there. Hold on. Ivan, you're on, just click on mute.
All right. Can you hear
There.
me okay
Yeah,
now?
we're good. We're good.
No worries. So that next stage to get a hold of a lawyer is when you're ready to create or refresh your contract template and have a lawyer take a look at that, making sure it's enforceable, it's up to date with your jurisdiction's latest legislation in Ontario, that it talks about prompt payment, that you have things like an entire agreement clause to make sure that the owner can't argue that verbal discussions have modified the contract. And then the other inflection point is when a project starts getting distressed. What I mean by distressed is the owner has expressed reticence to pay
Mm,
and you are starting to get that bad feeling in your stomach that this person is going to try to take from you
right.
unlawfully. And getting some initial device, like advice on how to diffuse the situation, in my view, can be quite helpful. And
Okay.
then even the lawyer can ghostwrite and help advise on some correspondence. Maybe they're in the background, they're invisible, but they're ghostwriting for you to set yourself up in the best possible position if you do have to progress things all the way to a
Right.
dispute with the owner. So those are the three times that I'd consider calling a lawyer. Definitely by the time the claim lands, in your hand from a process server,
Hmm.
yes, of course, call a lawyer to help prepare a defense. But by then, you've lost a few opportunities to put yourself in a better position.
Right. Right. So, I mean, maybe I can speak on behalf of, some. I think we're going to have a good group of guys in here that they know that their paperwork is weak. They know their contracts are weak, and we know from our surveys and stuff that a lot of contractors, even seasoned contractors, are worried about their contract specifically,
Mhm.
right? What are the steps to, moving themselves to being protected? Again, and the type of lawyer they should be contacting, besides you for, if you're in Ontario, but like what kind of lawyer? Because that's a confusing point as well. Like, how
Yeah.
do they get this problem addressed, and what are the steps?
All right. Great question. So, of course, it doesn't have to be me. If I'm giving advice to somebody on how to find a great lawyer, I think it's a mix of diligence that you want to do. So, number one, just like pricing out and qualifying any type of service provider, you want to talk to more than one. That's ideal.
Hmm,
So you can do a bit of a cross compare. I wouldn't make price your number one consideration
I would agree.
because the lowest cost lawyer may not be where you want to realize cost savings in your business. That may end up
Hmm.
costing you more down the road. So I would look for somebody with a specialty and not for a generalist. So you don't want a corporate lawyer moonlighting as a construction lawyer and they've done only two construction contracts in their lives. You do not want to rely solely on something like AI to
Hmm.
generate contractual provisions because AI will make something that looks great and seems to read well, and then you may get legal advice on it and find it's completely unenforceable in your
Hmm.
jurisdiction. So that can be a huge trap. I think Jay, you referrals are great if you have somebody who has a great contract and is like at the level of sophistication that you want to be,
Hmm.
and you get an intro. But I say that that should be mixed and counteracted with some separate diligence, checking out their profile, calling around, and often sometimes lawyers recommending other specialists in their jurisdiction is some of the strongest recommendations that you can get because
I
that's
agree.
somebody who's not just a layperson thinking that somebody is a great contractor. Like, I personally would want a plumber recommended by another plumber To
Right.
me, that's the best recommendation I could get because it's like another specialist who highly regards somebody else or says, "No, I am an expert in this type of plumbing for your type of job. These are the specialists in my area that I know so well who I would turn to for advice." That is the
Hmm.
absolute best. And those are the types of referrals that I seek to gain from the Canadian and the Toronto legal community here. I want them to think of me.
Well, that's very interesting because that's actually exactly how we got in contact. So, I mean,
Yeah.
that's how I met with you, and I'm
Yeah.
glad that I done because you've got me out of a lot of hot water. And again, I will attest to the other point that you make.
Yeah.
Not the place you want to go cheap on for sure, because there is a very, very big difference between somebody that's an absolute expert and just put yourself in those shoes as well. And again, you got to remember, when you get into some of these claims um, you're you're going to be fighting for things that you didn't expect to be fighting for, and they can escalate very quickly. And if you don't have somebody that gives you both sides of the story, leads you down the garden path, you will not be happy with the outcomes. And again, I use a couple of examples. I've had great law firms that I felt I was treated well with, and in all respect, I have been, but didn't understand what tools we could use to be on the offensive. So it was constantly playing defense. And when you play defense, it's an expensive game, more expensive and time consuming and frustrating than having someone that, is an absolute expert and that can go on the attack for you versus, playing defense. And that's, one thing that is a stark difference for me. And, just in learning about, adjudication and stuff like that, that was, I've had many big firms that not once mentioned it to me, and it could have resolved many things.
Mhm.
And when you introduced that to me, it was it was by design, I'm sure, but it's opened my eyes to like, hey, you know what? And I wasn't paying a low fee by any means, but it's better to work with somebody who's just a killer in that space. And like you said, when you're recommended by a downtown Bay Street lawyer to you, and I didn't have to be concerned, and they were right to recommend you in the
Mhm.
in the situation. So I'm glad that we met that.
Yeah, thanks, Jay.
Um,
Can I just add a couple things about looking for
Absolutely.
legal counsel too? I
Yeah.
would suggest a few things. So, notice and be aware of paying a location premium.
Mm.
So in the Ontario example, there is absolutely a documented premium for hiring legal counsel from our metropolitan area, our downtown Toronto, which is wannabe New York. Obviously, if you hire a Manhattan lawyer in New York, they're just going to come at a premium irrespective of quality based on real estate prices. So I myself, I'm located outside of the downtown core. That was deliberate. Could I have an office downtown Toronto? Of course. Do I want
Hmm.
to communicate a mid-market value proposition to my clients? Absolutely. So my office, and it's where I'm from, and I grew up local to the area as well, so I have more ties here. But be aware of if you are hiring a lawyer and you're paying a premium based on location, for some people, that's very important. They want their lawyer to have a certain address. To me, that's not the highest and best value for dollar that I want to pay for. I want to be paying for quality and getting the job done more than geography. So I just wanted to make that point, Jay. Maybe
Yeah,
that's a
that's
bit of a promotional based on my own
mm.
location. It's based in part perception. Some people think they want a Wall Street lawyer or a Bay Street lawyer.
What
Fair enough, to each their own,
what
but
happens if you
they're
want to fight Bay Street lawyers? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
then you need a brawler from Markham, Ontario, I guess.
There you go. Well said.
All right. So what should we talk about next?
So I think again, we've given out a lot of information here.
Mhm.
I think the crowning message that I'd love to get across to my audience and anyone watching in, and especially the ones from Ontario, is you know get your contracts checked, right? If you are concerned about these things, or if you feel like it could help you. I mean, Ivan's here to make an offer for that today, and I hope that some of you guys take him up on it. Even if you are confident, again, I'm extremely confident in mine. Like I said, mine was written in blood and tears. But Ivan was very quickly able to point out things that, hey, you know what? Like things have changed. You should adjust these points. And again, it's what happens when you're in the fire that really matters in these clauses, and again, how quickly you can, you know, backtrack your way out and prevent these problems. So I would, highly recommend anybody that's on, get your contracts checked. If you're here in Ontario, I absolutely, again, I recommend Ivan for any, of these types of claims. And, I don't give out referrals very easily. And anyone that's in our group knows that. I don't, necessarily go out of my way to refer anyone specifically. But again, he's got me out of hot water. I've been to battle with this man. So, and we were successful. So, again, if you are concerned, I think, just you take the referral that I'm offering and my advice, and get your contracts checked. For anyone that's outside of that area, again, if you haven't had it checked for a while, if you're concerned about things, right? And one of the best advice that I can give personally is every job that doesn't go well offers you an opportunity to learn. All right. And it's not just learning the hard way and then repeating the mistake. It's learning and then implementing something to prevent it from happening. So again, when I've run into these situations, and again, I can look at every one of my clauses and I can attach it to a job and a customer and a nightmare that I lived through, that's the reason it's there. What I'd love to say to everyone here is you don't have to do it that way. It doesn't have to be that way. Because again, if I had been maybe a little more proactive earlier in my career, I could have prevented having to learn those things the hard way. And that's where you want to have someone like Ivan that's been around and understands these things, getting those things into your contract. Because, you know, you will find out that, hey, you don't need it till you need it, right? And again, they pop up so quickly. That's where you want to have a good contract in place and, be working with the right people. I think that's the big message that I'd like to make sure everyone's leaving here with.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can add a couple things to that, Jay,
Sure.
a few things that a good contract will help you do. It front loads some of those difficult discussions that you
Absolutely.
have, talking about some potential bad scenarios, and will give you a little bit of a preview into who you're going to be doing business with, right? Is
Absolutely.
how they talk to you, how they express concerns about it,
Hmm.
and whether there's somebody who can be reasoned with and is willing to compromise with you and talk through those problems, or expresses immediate distrust and tries to reject a deal because they see you to be protecting yourself, and they
Right.
want to deal with people who are not protecting themselves, and
That's right.
they reject the idea of you having a contract that pins them down, clarifies their payment obligations, and all those things. So be aware of those wolves in sheep's clothing who,
Hmm.
are looking for people who have poorly documented projects and contracts because they have potentially experience with taking advantage of those
Yep.
situations. Um, Other things you can do, sometimes some basic Google due diligence about folks can go a long way.
Totally.
There are public court databases you can search that could
Hmm.
find out, especially on the commercial end, getting a sense of how litigious somebody is. You can do that type of research that can be very, very helpful. And then in the same way Jay's talking about taking feedback from your projects, take feedback from the reactions you get to your contract. One of the main complaints I get and the constraints is it's not about what people want to see in the contract. It's don't make it more than X pages,
Right.
because they've had the experience where as soon as a client sees a contract that's more than X number of pages, it's like reject, scary.
Right.
And so I've actually done for different clients two versions of their contract, a
Hmm.
more long form for the more sophisticated owners that are not scared off and the dollar amounts are larger, so it justifies it. And then a short form version
That's
that
great
looks more
advice.
like a purchase order. It
Yep.
can be small print,
Yep.
but if it all fits in 2 pages, just psychologically, that's less intimidating for some people. So
Couldn't agree more. And with that said, you bring up a good point. Making sure the language is like something a normal person can read and understand.
yes.
Again, I've gone out of my way to make my contracts that way to
Mhm.
the extent that as far as I can go. But like it's super important that again, when you're having that conversation from, your contract to production, that you can reference those clauses and nobody's confused by what it means,
Mhm.
right? And again, talking at the level that your client is accepting of will prevent that from happening.
Mhm.
And then the last thing that I would love to incorporate for anyone that's taking these high risk jobs, or doing any commercial business right now, as far as I'm concerned, you check their credit reports. You can order those for free. We do it on even our existing customers. We are pulling commercial credit reports because we can see their lawsuits and their liabilities that are coming out. And guys, you would not believe the number of contractors that are underwater in big lawsuits that, again, 3 years ago, we had a great project with them. Now we look at their records and we're not going near them with a 10-foot pole, right? And
Mhm.
you might notice, again, your suppliers are going to be asking for a lot more, uh, credit reports on you. So, I mean, again, there is a growing, obviously, stresses in the market, and construction has been hit pretty hard. That is a $25 best money you've ever spent in your life. It goes beyond having to, chase people down. And I mean, again, for us, we have it on a commercial plan. We check everyone's credit because that's our first indicator. If they've got, and it shows the lawsuits, it shows, who they haven't paid, it shows, what suppliers they have. And again, if you want to take it, even a bit further, checking, what legal claims they have, going into the courts and figuring that out, especially on big high dollar value or long-term contracts, where you're locked in and you basically are getting married, you want to do that due diligence because, I mean, again, like I said, there hasn't been, when I started doing that, I mean, we reject probably 15 to 20%. All right. This year has been, in the upper 30s, right? So just, looking at them and on face value, like I can attest to, there are wolf in sheep clothing out there that will even fool you at that, right? So,
Mhm.
you want to take all the protections and again make sure that you're dealing with honest people that have a good reputation for paying their bills and not dragging people through very expensive claims, right?
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, you want to take a peek under the veil before you say I do.
That's right.
Uh, make
That's
sure
right.
you're taking a good look before it goes final.
Yep.
Absolutely. And then a couple other comments. I mean, we didn't talk about downstream contracting very much, Jay. We're very much thinking about the upstream, who you're contracting with, how
Mhm.
you get the money, but making sure that you know what kind of deals you're entering into downstream. If
Mhm.
you're operating in Ontario, be mindful that that prompt payment obligation is a flow down. And so you owe prompt payment
Right.
obligations to people underneath you. And there are specific forms under the Construction Act that you need to send people if you do not intend to pay their invoices. And that
Right.
can protect you from being on the receiving end of what is colloquially described as a smash and grab adjudication,
Yeah.
where somebody delivers an invoice that's inflated, false for things they didn't deliver or for things that are horridly deficient that your owner is never going to pay for, and you want to defend against a claim from this shady sub that you've unfortunately
Very, very
gotten
good point.
into business with, right? So, contracts are as much about, defense as they are about offense, and
Mhm.
remembering that your contract's downstream to protect you so you're not in a position of having to pay somebody for shoddy work equally as important.
Absolutely. That's well said and a good point. So guys, as we get wrapped up here, just want to say thanks for everyone that's still stuck out. I think I've got all my Ontario guys now. So if you wanted to get a hold of Ivan, I've put his contacts here in the chat a couple of times. Again, if you're looking for any advice, especially contract terms, get in touch with him. Let him know that you're a member here at Contractor AI, and yeah. Appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate your time, Ivan, for coming out and having this chat with us. And